Your two buddies are helping you move one sunny morning. Driving down the road, looking out on acres of serene farm fields, you spot a jacket on the side of the road in a ditch. A jacket which will ultimately provide the nickname for one of the more infamous murder cases in the annals of true crime. My name is M. William Phelps. I'm an investigative journalist and the New York Times best-selling author of dozens of true crime books. I've dedicated the past 26 years of my life to helping families of the missing and murdered. Join me. We're crossing the line. Troy, Ohio is about 20 miles north of more well-known Dayton. Troy lies along the Great Miami River, a tributary of the Ohio River. Out where Greenlee Road and Horseshoe Bend Road converge in a T-shaped pattern, anywhere you look, at certain times of the year, all you'll see are bare farm fields, with the occasional farmhouse and barn in the distance. It's wide open, spread out, flat as a tabletop, as they say. It's April 24th, 1981. Three young men are out on Greenlee Road, close to where the road connects to Horseshoe Bend Road. One of the men is moving into a new place. The other's there to help. Moving sucks. I think we all know that, which is why we suck our closest friends into helping us. As they pass that intersection, the dude moving into the new residence spots what looks like a new coat lying in a ditch. "Hey," he says as they drive past. "That's a nice jacket." They continue on towards their destination, not really paying much attention to the coat. The next time they pass by the same area, they stop and the dude tells his friend, "Go take a look at that jacket." The coat is lying on the grass in a ditch just off the road. It is a distinctive jacket with a buckskin-like texture they can easily make out, which is probably what caught the guy's eye to begin with. One of the men walks closer to have a better look. "Oh my God," he says to the others, who are by now approaching up from behind. "There's a woman in that coat." One of the men works for the fire department and has his radio with him. He knows right away the girl is likely dead and that they should not go near the immediate area surrounding her. The first law enforcement officers to respond are from the State Highway Patrol, with the thought that the girl had been struck by a hit-and-run driver and left for dead. Never can tell out here on these roads, especially at night. If someone is walking and wearing dark-colored clothing, you might not see them until the last moment after you've already hit them. The State Highway Patrol arrives, takes one look at the girl in the buckskin coat, and knows they are not looking at a hit-and-run victim. So, they call in the Miami County Sheriff's Office under the pretense that there has been someone found in a ditch just beyond the tarred section of roadway, and it looks to be a young woman who has been murdered. It was like someone had just laid her in there, one of the men who found her later recalls to a local paper. Probably in her 20s, she is lying on her side in the fetal position. She has no shoes or socks on. As investigators survey the crime scene, it's clear that she had been murdered and dumped. A tiny woman, about 5'6", 125 pounds, with freckles and what one reporter described as a ruddy complexion. She is wearing bell-bottom blue jeans, those 70s era pants with the flared-out hems towards the bottom, bell-shaped. She also has a brown or tan turtleneck sweater on, which has an orange crisscross design on the front of it. Yet, the most distinctive part of her wardrobe, which will ultimately provide her true crime nickname, the Buckskin Girl, is described as a handmade tan buckskin pullover jacket, or poncho. The coat also has a dark purple lining with fringes along the bottom sleeve seams. Obviously, the first task is for investigators to identify the victim. In some cases, as would be the situation here, that task can prove to be the most difficult, especially during a crime-solving era when forensics is not at its most productive moment. The three dudes who found her have no idea who she is, they tell investigators. We were driving along the road, and boom, there she was. With her long red hair, plush white skin, and that rather rare coat, finding out who she is and why she was out on these roads should not be difficult once they can get word out. This is what investigators initially believe, anyway. Somebody must know the woman. Is she local? Perhaps she's someone from town people know as a wanderer. In a lot of small towns, I think maybe many of you would agree, there's those people we see on the road when we're driving all the time walking. The same familiar faces. Is she one of those people? The coroner provides what is, within the first day, the only real evidence and distinctive descriptive features they have so far. Several scars. One on her left arm, two on her left wrist, one under her chin, several more on her right foot, ankle, and hand. Those could help in identifying her. The first major obstacle in what will make the investigation a bit more difficult comes when the coroner reports that she was likely murdered 2 days before she wound up in that ditch. The other disturbing fact is that she had been severely beaten before she was strangled, and, oddly enough, has a lacerated liver. Contrary to what one might expect in this situation, however, the Buckskin Girl, according to the medical examiner, was not sexually assaulted in any way. One other unique feature standing out, which could also possibly help to identify her, is that she wore her hair braided into pigtails. Her eyes are light brown like coffee, and her nose is described as, quote, very pointed. She was gorgeous and young, and investigators say publicly, within the first few days, she was probably hitchhiking, which I think is sort of a go-to at the time whenever a young female victim is found along a roadway. There is a certain blame the victim mentality about this allegation. I understand police need to make this public, so if anyone had seen her along the roadway or even picked her up and given her a ride, they might come forward. But it should always be preceded by, we think she might have been hitchhiking, or we don't know for certain, but she could have been hitchhiking. Hitchhikers had a label attached to them back then, as if they were hippies, dregs, down and out, drug users, etc. So the label hitchhiker then always carried with it a certain amount of disgust, which is unfair to the victim. In these cases where you do not know the identity of the victim, what you say, how you describe her publicly, and whatever you first put out publicly becomes important and vital because it is going to follow that victim forever. And so if your case goes cold, which this one soon will, whatever you brand this victim first is how they will always be looked upon and remembered. And, in truth, a label or brand could hurt an open investigation. Once someone is labeled, it's hard to get the public to switch gears. Within a few days, investigators begin to realize that identifying the woman they are referring to as the Buckskin girl, a Jane Doe, is not going to be easy. Nobody comes forward claiming to know her. She doesn't match any local missing person cases. They do have dental records and fingerprints, so that will help with the national databases. But if she was, per se, passing through town or was with someone who happened to be driving her across the country and decided to kill her and dump her midway, finding out who she is will prove nearly impossible if she was never arrested and her fingerprints are not on file anywhere. Dental records become important when a positive identification is done. But tossing dental records into a database is not something that can be done at the time. Remember, it's 1981. Not one of the golden ages, as I said earlier, of breakthrough forensic technology. The tools that law enforcement have at their disposal are very limited. Her fingerprints come back and do not match any on file in any of the databases available at the time. Her description, moreover, fails to match any known missing person reports across the country. Stuck now, investigators decide to release a composite drawing of the Buckskin girl. This first drawing is kind of crudely done and accomplishes no valuable information as to her identity. As they do this, they begin to believe that the Buckskin girl is from another state, far away from Ohio. One important clue is that her feet are clean. If you recall, she was found without shoes or socks. So the fact that there is no dirt on the bottom of her feet gives investigators what they perceive to be, at the very least, a starting point. I'll get into that and where the investigation heads next, after we take our first break. You are listening to Crossing the Line with M. William Phelps. This buckskin jacket is interesting. Light tan in color rather than brown. The poncho-like overcoat has tassels along the sleeves and the bottom waistline. That darkish brown turtleneck she was wearing is tight-fitting with a sort of vest-shaped checkered crisscross pattern. So that's very distinctive. I think if somebody sees an image of that and that person they know is missing, they'd call in. But months pass, then years, and investigators looking into the murder of the roadside Jane Doe in Troy, Ohio, have absolutely nothing to go on, despite the unique clothing she was wearing and her unique look. Frustration mounts because without being able to identify the girl, investigating her murder becomes a near impossibility. Without friends and family to speak to, where do you even begin to create a timeline of her movements leading up to her murder? And if you are a weekly listener, you've heard me say that a timeline early into a murder investigation is a crucial part of piecing together what could have happened and, more importantly, who is behind the crime. From 1981 all the way up until 2016, some 35 years, mind you, nothing really happens in this case. They do, by then, have a far better computerized composite of the girl, but still, even with that, nobody comes forward and identifies her. And I can tell you from experience that it is sometimes as simple as getting the composite out in the right areas. In 2016, at their wits' end, investigators decide to come out publicly and announce what they have been working on throughout the past several years. I have heard of cases in which botany has been used to help identify not only victims, but connect murderers to homicide scenes. In one case, a seed found inside a bag where a victim had been zipped up in and dumped in a river was tied back to a rare tree in the yard of the victim and where she lived with her husband, pointing to his potential role in her murder. In Ohio Jane Doe's case, the Buckskin girl, they had sent her jacket off to be analyzed for any pollen that might be embedded in it to see if they could tie that pollen to a certain geographic area of the country. Remember I said before the break that her feet were clean? Well, the running theory behind that observation became that there was no doubt she was murdered in a second location and dumped in that ditch, and that her shoes likely could have tied her back to where she was when she was last alive. So they feel that this pollen exploration is worthy of maybe giving them a clue as to where she is not only from, but where she spent the last moments of her life. After that analysis is complete, investigators come out and claim that Jane Doe is likely from somewhere in the Northeast or New Jersey. The analysis from her jacket and clothing points to pollen found specifically in those areas of the country. It was, in fact, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children who had suggested the pollen analysis. In further speaking to the scientists testing the clothing, they say it is likely she either spent 1 or 2 years in the Northeast or is from that area based on the pollen samples they extracted from the clothing. Such finite microscopic samples, which can only be seen under a microscope, they explain are from the dry oak forest region of the country, which includes Connecticut, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. That is a large area, I'll say. So good luck with that. But as cumbersome as searching those regions seems, it does narrow things down where you can, at the least, begin to focus your search for who she is. You need a starting point. This is it. Another interesting find within this same testing reveals that her coat and clothing had high levels of soot, which they believe is from vehicle traffic, as if she had lived in the city or spent the last months of her life in the city. Even her undergarments were covered with soot particles, one scientist notes. Then an anomaly. They find more pollen on her outer clothing, suggesting that it comes from a much drier region of the country, like the Southwest, West, or even northern Mexico. This leads investigators back to the hitchhiking theory, that she was hitchhiking all over the country and wound up, by the choice of her killer, in that Ohio ditch randomly. All of this, of course, leads nowhere, ultimately, as you might have guessed by now. On paper, it all sounds good and potentially productive, but in the end, what does it actually give you in the sense of finding out who she is and where she could have come from? I have been involved in these types of fruitless searches before, and they become beyond frustrating. With a medical examiner's office investigator, I once spent 2 years trying to get the money and resources to help identify one of Happy Face killer Keith Jesperson's Jane Doe victims, whose body was found in Florida. We did this for isotope analysis to be conducted on her bone marrow and bone. In that case, it finally got done, and the results told us she was from the southeastern part of the U.S. Georgia, Alabama, Florida, somewhere in that area. In the end, she was identified by forensic genetic genealogy, and it turned out she was from the upper Midwest. So you can go down these forensic rabbit holes, think you are getting somewhere, but you are way, way off. Yes, you might be one step closer to solving your case, but at the same time, it can feel like you are chasing a ghost. Theories begin to pop up throughout the years that the Buckskin girl, because she is a redhead, is one more victim within what has been called the redhead murders. Several sex workers and exotic dancers, all of whom allegedly had red hair, murdered throughout the country. Another one of those internet-based, ridiculous, contrived conspiracies related to serial killer hysteria, which turns out to be nothing more than nonsense. They look into the theory that she is a runaway, maybe a foster child, a woman who is just wandering all over the United States. And yet one look at her teeth and the overall condition of her body, and you can rule all of that out based on the fact that she had taken care of herself. She had perfectly good hygiene, and her teeth had been worked on and were in excellent condition. A homeless wanderer, foster child, or runaway would not have the hygiene that she had. Another interesting find, which tells me how science can sometimes be incredibly subjective, is when the isotope analysis in Buckskin Girl's case comes back from her hair and fingernails and reveals that she spent some time in the southeastern part of the United States. That specific test indicated that the Buckskin Girl had spent the last 6 months of her life or so before her murder in the southeastern section. Yet the pollen tests, if you recall, say she was likely in the northeast. If I am an investigator and all of this information is coming in, my head is freaking spinning. I am going out of my mind. Which is it? Northeast, southwest, southeast? Where do you even begin? And I mention all of this detail here because I want you, my listeners, to understand how complicated investigations like this can become. We might tend to think, based on what we see, that things move along at a consistent A to B to C clip, with some bumps in the road along the way. The truth is, 99% of investigations lead to a dead end. You are in the game to walk into the office one day and bang, that 1% you've been searching for is staring at you in the face. When that happens, the 1% negates suddenly all of those dead ends. They do make some strides throughout the 2000s after DNA goes through a kind of sea change in helping investigations, with major advancements in technology taking place. NamUs, the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, comes back with having put Ohio Jane Doe's fingerprints through their database, along with her dental records, and they can now say for certain that she is not one of what are then about 225 missing teenage girls and women they have been searching for. So ruling Buckskin Girl out of that pool of missing people is a plus. Then, in 2018, the Miami Valley Regional Crime Laboratory calls investigators with news. Big news. They had been working on an early version of forensic genetic genealogy, as we know it today, in conjunction with the DNA Doe Project and the Full Genomes Corporation. And they developed a hit. I mean, do you see how many agencies are involved here? How many different people? I just want to point that out. This stuff can become very complicated and time-consuming. But tenacity and determination, passion, and honestly, empathy, and the care of forensic scientists and investigators never giving up is what ultimately gets you the answers you have been searching for. This hit was on a first cousin, which is a huge hurdle within this type of genealogy. That's a direct descendant, basically. 1 degree of separation. From that first cousin, it was not hard to work down the family tree and find the one female within the age range of Buckskin Girl within that family who had been missing for 30 plus years. Now, investigators, finally, after so many years of searching, they have a name. I'll get into who she is and where her name and hometown take the investigation after another short break. "37 years is a long time, but that is what it took to put a name to Buckskin Girl. Marcia Lenore King is her name. Marcia was 21 years old when she was murdered. She grew up in Arkansas. Marcia had been buried in Troy, Ohio, under the name Jane Doe since her body was found. No more would that gravestone hold such a loss of identity or have a faceless, nameless, ghost-like image connected to it. Now Marcia's name could be etched in stone above her remains. She had her life back. One of the hindrances in identifying Marcia turned out to be that her family, for whatever reason, never reported Marcia missing. Maybe they assumed she had taken off and would someday reach back out to them. When she is finally identified, the family come out and say they want privacy and do not even release a statement to the media. And so there is not a lot of information from them on record about Marcia. The sheriff's office comes out and says that law enforcement never forgets. We've had a long journey, but we did it. We have her name. As far as the investigation now goes, the focus, the sheriff says, is Marcia's movements during the last months of her life. They zero in on her having been to both Louisville and Pittsburgh. So both of those pollen tests they did were kind of accurate, at least in one sense, Pittsburgh. Now, doubling back here for a moment to this alleged redhead murder myth. The idea of redheads being murdered across the country, and many of them being connected with a serial killer at large whose obsession is with redheads, is ridiculous. The states which usually come up when you go down into the gutter of this nonsense are West Virginia, Mississippi, Arkansas, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Pennsylvania. The years most focused on are from 1978 and 1992. And the link here is, as I said, red hair, with the added connection being the bodies dumped near major roadways. How about the brunette murders? Or the blonde murders? Because we could just as easily take those same years and those same states and find a series of murders linking those hair colors. Redheaded victims found near roadways are not connections. They're characteristics and forced consistencies. The FBI piped in on this wild theory and said it's a myth, that a lot of the so-called redheaded victims actually had their hair dyed and were not even actual redheads, and that many even had reddish blonde hair. The Bureau called it what it is, a media-driven hoax with so many insignificant inconsistencies and forced square pegs into round holes that it was not really even worth commenting on at any great length. So although there could be a serial killer who prefers redheads, there is no serial killer out in the world targeting redheads specifically. In the end, when you get into actual serial killer data collected by the FBI and even several universities who track data, it is very rare that you find serial killers targeting very specific groups of victims. If there is a group they target, it would be vulnerable victims. To categorize serial killers into groups, or to say that a serial killer only kills one way, or is of a specific psychology, is inaccurate and does no service to his victims and solving those crimes. So I just want to put this theory to bed that the Buckskin Girl, a redhead, could be part of this so-called red-headed serial killer myth. I need to take one more break, come back, and conclude Marcia King's case. "14 days before Marcia King was found in that ditch back in Ohio, investigators learn eyewitnesses place her in Louisville, Kentucky. The sheriff's office had actually spoken to 6 people connecting Marcia back to Louisville. Then another twist in the case, which kind of throws things into a new direction for investigators. Marcia was actually a registered resident of North Little Rock, Arkansas. In building out a timeline of Marcia's movements, the sheriff's office put Marcia in Little Rock as well just 2 weeks before her murder. She boarded a bus there on April 6, 1981, and traveled to Louisville. They can place her in Louisville on April 10th, and they come out and say they are certain she was murdered on April 22nd and dumped between then and when she was found on April 24th. But here's the twist. They believe she was traveling with and involved in a cult, or as they have been called, a religious organization, which I think is generous in this instance. The name of the cult is The Way. According to the latest research, The Way International is described as a non-Trinitarian Christian organization. The group likes to say it is a biblical research and teaching ministry, which most Christian-based cults will say. Former members call it a cult, as do religious scholars and anti-cult organizations. They base their opinions on the fact that the group has an authoritarian leadership and utilizes manipulation as a practice to control people. I like to put it more plainly. If it looks like a cult, sounds like a cult, acts like a cult, it's a freaking cult, period. And if Marcia King was involved in this cult and decided to leave the cult, well, all bets off. Sorry there's no bow to place on the end of wrapping up this episode. Since 2018, the investigation is kind of stalled. Marcia King's murder remains an open case as we speak. I will say they do have rootless hairs not belonging to Marcia from the crime scene. And in 2020, those hairs, which are called molecular witnesses, were sent out to be tested. New technology offers the opportunity to test rootless hairs against foreign hairs in a federal national database. So that is a big plus. With a case this old, evidence this old, and not a lot of evidence at that, it is going to be difficult to solve using forensics. If it is solved, my guess is the resolution will likely come from a witness stepping up and saying something. If you know anything, of course, reach out to the Miami County Sheriff's Office in Ohio at 937-440-6085. That's 937-440-6085. Or you can go to this show's website and send the tip to me. You can also submit an anonymous tip on the Ohio Attorney General's website. I'd like to say that you, the listener, matter the most to me within what I do here on Crossing the Line, beyond victims and their families, of course. So if you have a case you want me to cover, and I can get the information I need to do the job I need to do, I'd be more than happy to take a look at it. Go to my website, mwilliamphelps.com, or the show website, crossingtheline.biz, and you'll find my email address. You can also reach me on social media at mwilliamphelps. And there's contact info in the Crossing the Line show notes for each episode. That's it for this week. Be safe. Be aware. Sources for this episode include Ohio Cold Case develops new timeline, Fox 16, April 10th, 2019. Details emerge in Buckskin Girl case by Shannon Mullen, Asbury Park Press, May 1st, 2016. Buckskin Girl identified after 37 years by Melody Value, Gazette News Courant, April 14th, 2018. Crossing the Line is executive produced by M. William Phelps, LLC, and Matthew Valentinus, Mom's Basement Management. Written by me, M. William Phelps. Audio mastering and mixing by Matt Russell. Music by Epidemic Sound. Original music written and performed by Thomas Mooney, Tom Phelps, and Matt Russell.